Hello model builders and aviation enthusiasts. I upped the challenge for myself in this video by custom painting this model with a more difficult camouflage pattern known as the Blizzard paint scheme. Currently, there are only 3 F-16Cs adorned with this particular pattern. 841301, a Block 25E, 860269, which is a Block 32D, and 870267, a Block 32F. All 3 jets are assigned to the 64th Aggressor Squadron based at Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas, Nevada. Nellis is a premier Air Force base in the U.S. hosting many red flag exercises with U.S. forces and allied nations from across the globe, and Nellis is the home to the Thunderbirds aerial demonstration team. After I finished basic training in electronics school, I was first assigned to Nellis Air Force Base for my first hands-on experience with the F-16. I also did subsequent TDYs there, so I have many memories of my times at Nellis. Let's take a look at what we have in this box. It's always fun to break open a new model kit. I like Tamiya models as the pieces fit well together and you get a nice amount of detail molded into each of the parts. This kit has a considerable number of pieces. There are 6 sprue bags with an additional 2 of clear parts, one of which is for an optional smoky colored cockpit canopy. There are over 230 pieces and lots of little detail parts, which I appreciate as a former F-16 guy. However, it looks like a lot of work for construction. There are 2 decal sheets, one for the standard F-16 markings and one for the California and Arkansas Air National Guard units. This will be another out-of-the-box build with no aftermarket parts. However, I have purchased custom decals from 2 Bob's Aviation Graphics. This sheet has markings in particular for tails 841301 and 860269. The instruction page is also complemented by pictures showing such features as the intake cover, engine nozzle plug, AOA probe covers, and even the cockpit ladder, so it is an excellent reference. I plan to use photo images off the internet to design my airbrush templates, but the 2 Bob sheet may work as a guide. All I have to do is to take some measurements of the model and the diagrams and make some calculations. If I have consistent enlargement ratios between the 2, I will have a working reference to make accurate airbrush patterns on the model. I just wanted to provide a few images of the instructions and show you how detailed and daunting this project is going to be to build. We have the throttle grip, which even has the throttle lever that goes from shutoff to idle to mill to afterburner. Even the flight control side stick controller has the transducer included, which converts pilot pressure inputs into electronic signals in the fly-by-wire system. The landing gear bays are amazing. I spent many hours under here during my career, and I can assure you this model is very true to the actual F-16. I'll have to tell you some stories about working under there and elsewhere on the jet later in this video. There are even polycaps to adjust the position of the horizontal stabilizers. For a 1/48 scale model, this is the most detail-rich kit I have ever come across thus far. As with about every airplane model, the construction begins with the cockpit parts. Here is the throttle grip and lever arm. And a little bit of show and tell. This is an actual F-16 throttle grip which I salvaged during my career after it was designated XB3, which means it is unusable and it goes into a general scrap heap. This first thumb knob is a potentiometer that allows me to slew the cursor on the radar screen and select a target. If I press down on this button, it locks onto the target selected. If I press again, it disengages the target. In modes such as ground map, I can increase the magnification of, say, a mountaintop with each depression of the knob until I cycle it enough times, returning to the normal magnification. Next is the radar dish antenna elevation knob thumb wheel. This allows me to manually move the dish up or down. There is a detent in the middle that lets me know the dish is centered without having to look at the radar screen. This spring knob is a speed brake switch which allows me to open or close the brakes in the back of the jet to increase or decrease drag. This switch is notorious, and I'll come back to it. This is the manual range uncaged switch used to vary radar gain and cage-uncaged missiles. Next is the UHF-VHF rocker switch. If I pull back, I transmit on the selected UHF frequency, and if I push forward, I transmit on the selected VHF frequency. Missing is the pinky locking trigger. This kept the throttle from moving forward if the engine was shut down, but it also prevented the throttle from being pulled too far back into shutdown if the engine was already running. The trigger had to be pulled in order to bypass that locking point. Now for this switch. It is the dogfight missile override switch, which allows for 20mm gun or air-to-air missile solutions which are displayed in the HUD depending on which position the switch is selected. This switch is awful because 95% of the time when a throttle grip had to be changed out, it was because a pilot or sometimes a maintenance worker kicked the switch and broke it off with their boot getting in or out of the cockpit. That switch invariably ended up in the cockpit and had to be searched for, and this grounded the jet immediately. A throttle grip is one of the most complicated parts to remove and replace on the jet because of so many little parts. When I first started out, it took me over an hour and a lot of expletives to replace one. But later in years, I could do the job in about 20 to 30 minutes.
Generally, there were only 3 reasons an avionics tech like me would be in the landing gear bay doing work: a weight on wheel switch problem, bore sight adjustments, or fuel quantity errors.
In the first scenario, there are 2 weight on wheel switches which we called wow switches. There is one in each main gear, left and right. These switches would engage or disengage depending if the jet was landing or just taking off, which let the F-16 know if it was flying or on the ground. This enabled or disabled certain parameters mainly in the flight control system of what the pilot could or could not input as an additional safety feature. We would have to set up a test box, open up some connectors, then connect them to our box and manually depress and release the wow switches and determine which one was malfunctioning, and we also looked at which of the 4 channels were failing, but it always seemed to be just one. We'd notify electric shop that actually changed these out, and it was a messy job. In the second case would be a bore sight, much like a car or truck alignment. The fighters go through heavy G-forces and get misaligned, which would eventually affect accuracy in shooting the 20mm gun and bombing targets. We would hang fixtures and attach inclinometers to determine the misalignment in the yaw, pitch, and roll axes. Usually we only had to enter corrections in the computers to compensate. But sometimes we would have to make physical alignment changes in the HUD, inertial navigation unit, and or the radar array mountings. Finally, there were fuel quantity problems. There are electrical connectors in the main gear bay that attach to the center pylon, which in turn attach to a centerline external fuel tank when they were used. Crew chiefs would often clean the bays with a power wash gun, much like the ones you find at a self-service car wash. They were supposed to cover up those connectors, but sometimes they do a poor job or completely forget. So a pilot is flying along with an attached centerline external fuel tank. He begins maneuvering, and then the water would move around in the connectors and cause mini electrical shorts, which cause the needles and the totalizer to move wildly and spin on the fuel quantity indicator in the cockpit. Also, the needles would split far enough apart to reveal red, which indicates a fuel imbalance and a potential hazardous flying condition. So we usually corrected this by blowing dry nitrogen gas to displace the water and dry up the plugs, but this could take a couple of hours sometimes.
This cockpit is small but extremely detailed, and I want to do a good job on it, even though it will probably be hard to see after the model is completed. It would be difficult to paint each knob and switch. However, I can use a sanding sponge to lightly scrape away the black paint on the raised portions and bring out the detail of all the controls. After the initial sanding, I can fine-tune using my knife. For fine painting such as this aircraft line, I use a sewing needle dipped in paint to highlight these types of features. Always use a wash where possible to bring out the detail and create shadow effects where appropriate. It really enhances the look and draws the eye of an observer. Using a cotton swab, you can adjust the overall appearance and attain the amount of grubby look you wish. In goes the cockpit and the landing gear bay with a portion of the intake. As usual, I won't show all the construction, but I will point out any steps if it involves a story about my career on the F-16 flight line, or if there is a point to be made about this kit. This set offers the option of adding the ADF AIFF antenna. These are usually installed on F-16s that are up in the north like Alaska or the North Dakota units. Occasionally, we'd get one of these jets transferred to my unit, but we did not use this system. We in avionics had to remove this AIFF antenna, cap the connectors, stow the cables, and disable the system. If we retired the jet to the boneyard, we had to reinstall everything to the original ADF configuration. None of the Blizzard F-16s are ADF configured, so I opt for the blank panel. It's time to mate the upper fuselage with the lower fuselage. I want a strong bond and a little slower cure time so that I can adjust the fit, so I used old-fashioned tester cement. With long glue lengths, be careful it does not leak out, or else you'll bond your tape or rubber band to the model itself. These parts fit well, and the lower fuselage has this seam which is actually correct for the F-16, and at first I thought this seam on the upper fuselage was unnecessary and that it was going to create work. However, I notice how there are panels on each side of the seam so that it creates one continuous line, which would be natural on the actual jet. So Tamiya has done a clever bit of planning in this step. All I have to do is clamp this so that the line is flush. Moving on to the engine nozzle, you can see that it is nicely detailed. This is an image looking down an F-16 engine nozzle, which I'll use for a reference. During my career, we lost an F-16B, which is a two-seater version of the F-16 due to an engine failure. The student pilot and the instructor pilot were able to eject safely, but as you can see, the jet was completely destroyed. Okay, let's get back to some model building. For the engine nozzle shaft, I'm creating a custom color I'll call Sandy White. It's a little tight in here, so it will be a challenge to get the patterns accurately represented within the burner. Next, I add a little brown. Then the black burn marks. This area is too small and confined to use an airbrush to create the burn marks, so I attempted to use a thick wash added in spots, then I planned to feather it out to create the tendrils as seen in the photograph. It's very dark in here and hard to see anyway, but it is satisfactory. I airbrush the outer nozzle. I follow this by adding paint to the aft end of the nozzle, highlighting the lines simulating the levers that control the aperture of the nozzle cone. Next, I dab a bit of oil-based black paint. Using a cotton swab again, I begin to bring out definition in the feathers and also create a lightly burned surface on each of those slats. This works out evenly and is much better than using a fine brush. In more clever engineering by Tamiya, they build up the intake with each part adding structure and hiding seam lines. Most F-16 models have you insert the anti-ice strut in the intake from the front using tweezers, which is difficult and can leave visible streaks of glue. Tamiya has you insert the strut from the top and into a lower intake floor slot. It's a great idea. With attention to even the smallest features, these rectangular pieces create the small ECS intake slots. It's just another great example of the excellent detail in this model. The VHF antenna for an F-16 is located at the top of the vertical tail's leading edge, and they're pretty reliable. Only 3 were replaced during my career that I know of at my unit. We had to climb a rickety stand to the top of the tail at about 16 feet to remove the antenna, and usually the screws were in pretty solidly with additional sealing action from the paint layers. This is one that was replaced from F-16B 790411. As you can see in this image, 0411 is being retired and transitioning to the boneyard, still having not been touched up with a repaint of the tail flash after I replaced that antenna. Finally, for a little nostalgia, here are a couple of pics I took from a KC-135 tanker of 790411 over California and also the Pacific Ocean in 1994. One of the dirtiest jobs on the F-16 for avionics techs is having to replace the left or right rear aft quadrant RTWS amps in the vertical tail behind panels 4427 and 4428, which are triangular panels on either side of the fairing.
These amps are just below the rudder ISA, and there was always a coat of leaked hydraulic fluid in here mixed with dirt, creating a greasy residue. There is only a small surface area on the fuselage for us to crouch down and work here. If the horizontal stabilizer was angled up, we could press up against it with our boots to help keep from pushing ourselves off the tail. Now some clips of construction. I don't have any stories about flaperons. Before we continue, we have to decide what the final external stores configuration is going to be. There are so many options. You can really load up this jet for bear. For this model, I've decided to load the AMRAAM 120Cs on the wingtips, the AIM-9M sidewinders on stations 2 and 8, the ALQ 184 ECM pod at the centerline position, and the wing external fuel tanks at 4 and 6. There are no special painted camouflage considerations made for the external stores, and they are in their standard colors, usually gray. This kit contains polycaps for external storage stations 4, 5, and 6. You might ask what the worst job for avionics is. In my opinion, it was to change out any fuel probes in any of the tanks of the main fuselage of the F-16. The fuel was drained from the aircraft, and it was towed into the fuel barn where all the access panels to the various chambers were removed. Then the fuel shop guys would depuddle any fuel remaining in the very bottom of the tanks by a vacuum system. But there was always some fuel around. The fuel vapors were just terrible, so you'd end up with headaches sometimes, and our uniforms would just reek of JP8. The spaces are so tight around the fuel probes that we had to use our smallest tools, and we would frequently drop them to the bottom of the tank and into any residual fuel. Usually, all the screws were practically self-sealed to the capacitance block, and we ended up stripping the heads. So it was smelly, cramped, and just plain aggravating. I had nightmares sometimes that we were being transferred to the fuel shop as a career change. I noticed during my military days that ECM pods were particularly dirty, and any of those that were painted in dark gray were prone to paint chipping. This is something that I'll have to account for during my weathering phase. The missile rails and pylons don't have many lines for us to pre-shade, but we can add random hits of black paint to add character and depth to these parts, which will be enhanced with the final gray coat. Speaking of pylons, I've got another story for you. An F-16C from Luke Air Force Base made an emergency landing to our base one year. It was affecting bombing runs at the range when either a pylon failure or a release failure allowed a practice bomb to pivot up and hit the leading edge flap of the right wing. I recently looked up this jet's history and now see it's assigned currently to my unit now. It has returned. In order to facilitate the external camouflage painting, I proceed out of building step order. I use white glue to temporarily attach items such as the landing gear doors. Moving along, I continue working on the external stores by putting a layer of paint over our pre-shade lines. As usual, we want to create an uneven and random appearance in the overall look of the part. The secret is to keep it subtle, but keeping enough of the black discoloration so that the observer catches the changes in the paint tones. I do this for all the external equipment to include the fuel tanks, ECM pod, the missile rails, missiles, and the pylons. I add and adjust a wash to bring out elements of the rivets and lines. I also do this to highlight the wheels and landing gear. As you might know, I like to create nozzles in my missiles. Here we go on the AMRAAM 120Cs. Since the overall camo has a lot of blue, I selected the striping standard of active missiles to add a little more color contrast. Alright, let's get moving on here. I'm not looking to make this particular jet a very beat up and faded model. So I'm going with the tried and true pre-shading technique. I don't have a specialized airbrush, so I apply closely to avoid just painting the model all black. It takes some finesse. It's looking more like I'm painting with gardening gloves on my hands. Luckily, our final paint coats can adjust the overall look. I'll just let the clips go here for a little bit without saying much. Maybe you'll find it relaxing just to watch the paint being applied. Prior to continuing with painting, we have to plan our camouflage blizzard patterns. I took measurements of the leading edges of the wing, horizontal stabilizer, and the line of the vertical tail where it attaches to the fairing base and compared to the two Bob's diagrams. I came out with a very consistent 2.12 times enlargement. And here are a few of my enlargements after I printed them out. The lines between the camo colors are very distinct and not diffused, so it will be easier to apply the different layers. We basically have 3 colors plus a separate nose radome color. I was going to use a cheap and simple technique I've used in the past and began cutting my airbrush templates out from my enlarged printouts to avoid the roughly $30 cost of purchasing custom painting stencils. Yet my cutouts were not fitting well due to the unusual shapes and the many curved surfaces of the model. I had to come up with a new approach. I decided to use my cutouts to trace pencil lines on the fuselage and wings. Starting with the lightest color first, I painted the Arctic gray within those markings, but I didn't worry about masking off to fashion sharp borderlines yet. I will refine the edges as I add the other camouflage. I then began cutting out the Arctic gray shapes out to mask and protect that color on the model. I temporarily attach the horizontal stabilizers to make sure the camouflage patterns are matching up with the main fuselage. I do the same for the vertical tail. Afterwards, I delineate the border with a pencil for the next camo color, light gray. Having completed the second set of markings, I add the light gray paint. Finally, I cover up the light gray areas so that both the Arctic gray and the light gray portions are masked off, leaving only sections exposed for the final camo of Aggressor Blue.
On the upper and lower portions, I take advantage of the pre-shading and the overspray of the two previous camouflage colors to generate areas of shadow and some fading. Now it's time to take off the tape and see what we have. The patterns began to reveal themselves as I removed each piece of tape. All the masking was quite painstaking, accounting for the 3 different colors. I referred to photo images of the Blizzard F-16s to clarify certain areas limited in the 2-dimensional diagrams on the 2-bob sheets, such as the space between the upper intake lip just below the cockpit. All in all, my approach came out with some decent results. It will only require a few minor touch-ups. And here are views of the bottom and top. The no-step lines and the air refuel door distance markings are black in this paint scheme. Rather than use the decals, I mask off the fuselage to airbrush them in. Once completed, I pull the tape off to see what I got. I sprayed on 2 layers to protect the painted surface for application of washes, weathering, and decals. I begin with the wash and fill in recessed lines and rivets. I work small sections at a time to concentrate my painting and the cleanup of the staining. In this scene, I work on the F2 fuel tank panels. The model's still shiny from the gloss coat, but the wash is done. Before we continue, I'll present one last flight line vignette. Here are the pitot-static air data and total temp probes that used in combination to determine the F-16's airspeed, altitude, angle of attack, Mach, and also the air density. And these are the actual parts in full scale. All of these were removed from F-16s because they eventually failed to heat up and prevent ice from forming on them. Here's a little guessing game for you. As you can see, this pitot-static probe is not quite normal. Can you figure out what's going on here? Is it A, the probe experienced runaway heating and began to sag? B, a crew chief backed a tug into it? Or C, this was recovered from the wreck of F-16B 780093? 3, 2, 1. The answer is B, a crew chief backed a tug into it. I'm stunned to discover the canopy glass is molded with a seam line down the middle. I'll have to use a very fine grit sanding stick and rubbing compound to buff it out. Some modelers are obsessed about crystal clear canopies on their aircraft, so much so as to dip them into clear floor wax. Jet canopies undergo crazing, which are micro scratches on the surface from flight ops and the wiping down before and after flights. Truth be told, there's no such thing as crystal clear glass on the flight line. Time to mate the glass with the canopy frame. In order to add some simple detail, I've cut a few bristles off this steel brush to fashion static discharges for the horizontal stabilizers, wings, and the vertical tail. I affix using cyanoacrylic glue for fast attachment. Time to throw in the ACES II ejection seat. More amazing detail around the glare shield. We have the AOA indexer, the upfront controls, the HUD, and the nose wheel steering and air refuel door lights here. And it goes to complete the internal cockpit. Next, I install the burner and the engine nozzle. Afterwards, I paint the nose radome. With the installation of the engine and the future attachment of the vertical tail and the stabilizers, I expect the model to be aft heavy. To counter this, I drop a spare nail into the nose radome and seal it in with candle wax to move the CG forward. I taped off the radome to paint in the flush-mounted static discharger disc columns. I then dry brushed in the lines. For my last major paintwork other than touch-ups, I airbrushed the canopy frame. This will be the very last part I install on the model after the final dull coat is applied over the surface of the model. It's time to put on the decals. I apply microset to wet the surface, and this also begins step 1 of the fastening process. I'll use these clips to demonstrate how I'm going to go about this on the entire jet and the external attachments. This stage can be frustrating since the decals tend to continue to move after you've positioned them where you want them. Once it's secure, I then dab on the microsol that actually sets the decal in place and melts it onto the surface. The decal may bubble and wrinkle as it moves into place, especially into crevices and raised surfaces that give it a more realistic look. The two Bob decals have the nice feature of not having much, if any, clear film around each of the labels, and they are quickly ready to be applied after being dipped into water, but they are delicate. Okay, we're about done and ready to do a final walk around of this model before putting it to bed. If you liked this video, please click on the thumbs up button and comment if there was an aspect or feature you enjoyed so that I can remember to include them in my future presentations. Take care, and we'll see you later.